Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 1306. Today we are dealing with the subject of Reconstruction and rebuilding the American South and integrating the country back again after the Civil War. Now, the overall sort of importance of this lecture is that what we tend to see with Reconstruction is that a lot of the sort of missteps that happened during this time period, a lot of the things that are going to develop during the Reconstruction period are going to give rise to a lot of what we're going to be dealing with later in the course, and things that we're still reckoning with even to this day. Obviously, with a very visible social justice movement and the call for equality in the United States, it requires us to go back and look at some of the origins of this inequality. Obviously, in History 1305, they're dealing with the issue of slavery. But we are going to be looking at, in Reconstruction, how the South is able to challenge federal laws and rebuild the old slave society after the Civil War. And so that's the main thrust. What we're going to see is just this constant back and forth where the federal government passes legislation to try to change the way that the American South has structured its economy, its society, and its racial relations. And then we're going to see challenges to those federal laws. We're going to see local laws and local interpretations of those laws being used to try to reinstitute the old slavocracy of the antebellum South. The Civil War came to an end in 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. That's when the South was forced to surrender. And we have to look back further. We have to go into the Civil War to start understanding the roots of Reconstruction. Because before the war came to an end, Lincoln is already looking at ways that he can start reintegrating the South back into the United States. By the time that the Confederate States surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, the South is economically, politically, and socially fractured. This is a society in ruins in a lot of ways. The war effort and Lincoln's issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation definitely hurt the Southern plantation economy and their agricultural output. Furthermore, we have to look at the social position and the political position of some of the Confederate leadership. Most of the leadership of the American South, their politicians, the people who guided their society, when the war is over, they are looking at a really bad situation. You have to remember, this war caused the death of 650,000 Americans, and as far as the Northerners are concerned, that is solely the responsibility and fault of the Confederate leadership. And so they are now devoid of leadership in the South because the former Confederate leadership is basically going to be seen as traitors, and many of them are going to face charges of treason when the war comes to an end. Then finally, on a social level, the former planter class, the people who own plantations, they were living in constant fear of the enfranchisement and the citizenship possibilities for millions of African Americans. Meanwhile, those same African Americans are reeling from centuries of this very, very oppressive form of slavery that's practiced in the American South, and they're also going to be dealing with these lingering notions of white supremacy. And so in a lot of ways, we're going to see that even throughout and after the Reconstruction period, the economic and social conditions of African Americans don't make a huge leap forward. When we start with Reconstruction, we have to first look at what Abraham Lincoln is thinking. And Lincoln's ideas are a lot different from another faction of the Republican Party that we're going to be looking at. Lincoln is a moderate Republican. And his goal throughout the war, if you look at his rhetoric publicly, he is always talking about maintaining the Union. And so it's not surprising that in the midst of the war, he's already thinking of ways to start putting the country back together. And in December of 1863, he introduces something known as the 10% plan. The 10% plan is a key term, something you're going to need to know about on your exams. Whenever we come across these sort of key terms, ones that are bolded in your textbook or in the PowerPoint lecture, it is something where you definitely want to stop and take note of that and understand that term. Be able to give it a time period, be able to give it some sort of identification, and then understand its significance. And when we look at the 10% plan, this is a plan that was put forth by Lincoln in 1863, and it's designed to establish new Southern state governments. As far as Lincoln is concerned, he thinks the country would be best off if we just forgot about the war and started to heal very quickly. And so, to this end, Lincoln, unlike some other Republicans in the North, is not looking to punish everybody who fought for the Confederacy or anybody who is complacent with its leadership. Really, what he's looking at with the 10% plan is he's reserving punishment for the most public of figures in the Confederate States, people like Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. This plan would basically pardon all the Southerners who would pledge their support to the Union and who would pledge their support for the emancipation of slaves in the American South. So, under this plan, high-ranking Confederate officials and generals would not receive amnesty. They would definitely still be facing prison terms for their role in the war. But this plan is incredibly lenient. When you look at it, all Lincoln is asking is for 10%, thus the name 10% plan. He wants 10% of a state's population to take this oath, swearing loyalty and support to the Union and supporting emancipation. Once 10% of that state's population has taken this oath, they can reform the government and request to be admitted into the Union. So when you look at this, with Lincoln's plan, 90% of people in a southern state could say, I still believe in the Confederacy, I still believe in slavery, and then that state could still be readmitted to the U.S. So, as you can imagine, there is a lot of opposition to Lincoln's 10% plan. Lincoln is seen as being way too lenient on the Confederate States by other Republicans. He represents a side of the Republicans known as moderate Republicans, but there's another faction. There's a group of Republicans in the North known as radical Republicans, and that's another one of those key terms. They are looking to they have three main goals in the post-Civil War period. Number one, they want to totally dismantle the Southern plantation complex. In other words, they want to destroy the economic mode of production that had existed in the American South prior to the war. But beyond that, they also want to totally dismantle the way that the plantation complex organized social interactions in the South as well. So they also want to ensure that all Southern combatants and contributors to the Confederate States and the Army would be punished for their role in the war. This is in exact opposition to Abraham Lincoln. And then the final goal that the radical Republicans are trying to achieve is to establish voting rights and economic opportunities for freed African American males, or what are known as freedmen in the post-war South. So, in opposition to the 10% plan, radical Republicans are going to put forward the Wade-Davis bill in 1864. And under this bill, it's going to be a lot more restrictive than the 10% plan. They are going to demand that citizens in former Confederate states take a much stricter oath of loyalty to the Union. This isn't just saying, I believe in the United States of America, or I swear my support, I pledge my allegiance to this nation. They're actually being asked to say, I explicitly denounce the Confederacy and everything that it stood for. Now, this would be a tough pill to swallow for Southerners, a lot of whom put their lives on the line to fight for the Confederacy. And so this is going a lot further than the 10% plan. A majority of that state would need to, at least 51% of a state's white males had to sign this oath before that state could be considered for readmission into the Union. Any white male who had fought for the Confederacy would lose his right to vote in any future elections, and he could not hold any state or federal office. This is very, very critical. Voting rights are a major sticking point in the post-war South, in the post-war United States, really. So when we're looking at this, this is also a time period in which people are talking about giving voting rights to African Americans. And so when you look at this from a Southern perspective, the Wade-Davis bill is saying African American males may get voting rights, but white males in the American South who had fought for the Confederacy would have their voting rights stripped. And then finally, all states being readmitted to the Union had to have a clear statement about the illegality of slavery built into their state constitutions. And they needed to make a proven commitment to ensuring the rights of freedmen. So, you can see how the Wade-Davis bill is going to go a lot further than the 10% plan. It's asking more of the South to get readmitted into the Union. So, those are both plans that are debated in Congress. The 10% plan never really goes into effect. The Wade Davis bill is in effect for a short period of time. But there's never really a consensus amongst Republicans as to how to move forward on this issue of Reconstruction. That is until late 1864 and early 1865. That is when Lincoln and moderate Republicans are going to be able to pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. This is the most critical step forward in ending slavery in the United States. The 13th Amendment is the first of a group of amendments that we collectively refer to as the Reconstruction Amendments. So the Reconstruction Amendments are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States. And they're all dealing with issues of African Americans' rights and citizenship after the war. So this is the only amendment passed before Lincoln is going to be assassinated in Ford's Theater. The 13th Amendment, and this is what you need to take away definitionally about this term. The 13th Amendment outlaws slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. Now, there's a few things I want to talk about related to this particular amendment. First, it outlaws slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. And you might be thinking, isn't that what the Emancipation Proclamation did? And the very, very astute answer to that question is no. The Emancipation Proclamation does nothing in terms of slavery in the United States. In fact, it is a war document. It's something that Lincoln, and remember, Lincoln is a lawyer. He understands what he can and can't do with his executive powers. And Lincoln understood that the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't work for the United States. In fact, the language of that document says slaves in secessionist territories, slaves in the Confederate States are free. It doesn't free anybody in the United States of America. This is particularly relevant because there's 4 states that stay in the Union during the war that still have legal slavery. These are Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky as well. These are the border states. They decide to stay in the Union even though slavery is legal in these places. And so when we look at this passage of the 13th Amendment, this is critical. Lincoln is seeing the end of the war, and he knows, I gave a bunch of people their freedom, and I promised it in basically perpetuity for the rest of time, that they could never be put back into slavery. Now the war is coming to an end, and he sees what I did with the Emancipation Proclamation won't hold up. This isn't legal. I had no real ability or power to do this as the President of the United States. And so he and the other Republicans are going to work together to pass the 13th Amendment. And this is the amendment that outlaws slavery in the United States. It outlaws involuntary servitude in the United States. But there is a caveat to this, and the South is going to capitalize on this. Slavery is illegal in the United States except as punishment for a crime. And so the southern states are basically going to use this caveat. They're going to say, okay, well then we're going to start arresting African Americans, convicting them of crimes, and putting them right back into slavery. So it is a really critical piece of legislation, but as I said, what we're really trying to get at in this lecture video, and I'm not going to be going through every single slide in the PowerPoint, but what I'm trying to show is this pattern of cause and effect. The North, or the Republicans in the North are saying, here, we are outlawing slavery. It's done. And then the South is going to say, oh, you left a loophole in the language. If we start arresting people, then we can put them back into slavery. And so that's very much what we're going to see going on again and again and again during this period. The North passes legislation, the South finds a loophole and fights back against it. Another key sort of thing you need to take away from this lecture for this week is the importance of the Freedmen's Bureau and the sort of execution of these Reconstruction plans on the ground in the South. After the passage of the 13th Amendment, the Freedmen's Bureau would be established by Congress in March of 1865. Now, it's one thing for people to sit around in Washington and go, I'm passing this law, and I'm going to tell you to do this from Washington, D.C., but you live in Alabama. Now, that's all fine and good, but as we all know, laws are just laws on paper. They don't really mean anything unless you have some way to enact those laws. We have speed limits in this city, but very few of us drive the speed limit. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau is critical because this is the agency that would actually carry out reconstruction plans on the ground in the South. These are the people down in the South setting up a safety net to help economically suffering African Americans. They're distributing food and emergency relief. They're also basically going to take federally confiscated lands that were taken from Southerners in the course of the war, and they're going to basically set up refugee camps. Remember, when slavery comes to an end, the relationship between the slave and the plantation is severed. They're no longer legally able to stay on these plantations. And so now you have a major homelessness problem in the South. Finally, the Freedmen's Bureau is instrumental in setting up schools for African American kids. And many of these kids are going to become the first literate members of their family because in many areas of the South, it was illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. So, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to become this really critical mouthpiece of the federal government down in the South. And they're really going to be the ones who are right there, ready, willing, and able to help African Americans who are trying to get on their feet. So the next topic that you're going to deal with as you're working through the lecture, the PowerPoint lecture, is the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. I'm going to breeze over that because it's a fairly common story, but we do need to stop and take a look in this video lecture at who comes in after Lincoln once he's assassinated. And that would be his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Johnson is picked because he is the polar opposite of Abraham Lincoln. Johnson is going to become the president of the United States when Lincoln is assassinated, but he could not have had further points of view. He couldn't have been further in terms of how he saw Reconstruction from Lincoln. He's picked as part of what is known as a national unity ticket. This is an idea that says if I have a weakness as a presidential candidate, then I'm going to pick somebody who makes up for that weakness as a vice president. In other words, there's always been a regional divide in the election in this nation between North and South. So if I were running for president as a Northerner, I would want to pick a Southern running mate to try and pick up votes in the South where people see me as an outsider. Really what we're going to see is that Johnson was brought up in slaveholding North Carolina. He was a Southern Democrat, but he remained loyal to the Union as a representative from Tennessee throughout the course of the war. And at first, it looks like maybe he's going to carry out the moderate Reconstruction plans of Lincoln, but as soon as he gets into office, he flips a switch. And he is going to be remembered as the veto president. From that point forward, all he tries to do as president is frustrate the efforts of radical Republicans. They're passing legislation trying to punish the South, trying to empower African Americans in the South, and he vetoes every bit of that legislation. So there is a constant battle between Johnson and the radical Republicans who dominate Congress at this point. So Johnson's approach to Reconstruction can be called haphazard at best. This is what's known as presidential Reconstruction. And basically, I'm going to sum it up very, very simply. This is what presidential Reconstruction represents with Johnson. He's going to say, go ahead and form your governments and then reapply for statehood. That's it. No punishment for former Confederates, no provisions for emancipation or getting rid of slavery in these states, no oaths of loyalty to the U.S. It's simply reform your governments, elect your politicians, and then reapply for statehood. Now, this is a huge, huge problem because a lot of the people who just fought a war against the United States are now going to be able to just come right back into their former positions of power. Politicians who were ruling in the pre-war South are going to come back into power in the post-war South because of Johnson's plans for Reconstruction. In addition to that, it's under Johnson that we start to see Southern states enact black codes. Now, I'll touch on black codes very briefly here. This is a major key term. I can promise you it's going to show up on your exam. You're going to need to be familiar with this. But black codes in general are a series of laws that barred African Americans from enjoying the rights of citizens and citizenship in the United States. Really, in essence, when you sum these up and make it really simple, The black codes are meant to re-enslave African Americans, to deny African Americans any constitutional rights that are being given to them, and to rebuild the old plantation culture of the South. And so we're going to look at these black codes a little bit more in a little bit more detail as we move forward with this lecture. But to sum it up, that's what they're all about. And they start getting passed during the time of Johnson. So ultimately, the Republicans look at Johnson and they say, ooh, this is ugly. This guy is not going to make it easy for us to rebuild the South in the way that we want to. So everything that Congress is passing, Johnson is simply vetoing. He's saying, I'm not passing this. I'm not signing this into law. And so when all these representatives come back from the southern states in 1866, under Johnson's plan, the South puts governments back together and they elect representatives. They come back to Washington in 1866, and Congress and Republicans in Congress say, no, you're not legitimate politicians. You don't even come from legitimate states. We don't recognize you in this union. And so, to take control back, Johnson has now allowed the South to do whatever they want. And the Republicans say we need to take control of Reconstruction again. And to do this, they extend the scope and funding for the Freedmen's Bureau, and they pass what's known as the Civil Rights Act in 1866. So the Civil Rights Act is going to state that people there is no provision for treating people differently in public and social settings, mostly in any institution that's publicly funded, because of their race, their ethnicity. Basically what the Civil Rights Act is saying is that all Americans are created equal, that we all have access to the same rights. But there is a major problem with the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 can be scrapped if new politicians come in and decide they don't like it. In other words, an act can be thrown in the trash can, but an amendment to our Constitution cannot. And so in order to make sure that the spirit of the first Civil Rights Act is protected, that it can't be thrown out if Southern Democrats were to take power in Congress again, the Republicans in Congress are going to move in 1866 to pass the second Reconstruction Amendment, the 14th Amendment. This is going to make sure that if there were any change in Congress, if different people came into power there, that equality for African Americans and citizenship rights for African Americans can't be thrown in the trash. So the 14th Amendment is going to state that all former slaves would be granted citizenship in the United States. And as citizens, they are entitled to equal protection under the law. Now, any state that refuses male citizens, including African American men, the right to vote would lose congressional representation on the federal level. All former Confederates would need a specific congressional pardon to hold office. And here we can see the Republicans are trying to say, I don't care what Johnson said. If you want to be a politician in the post-war America, you need a pardon from Congress, not from Johnson. Finally, it goes one step further, and it says to former slave owners in the South, you cannot be compensated by any state or federal government for losses sustained during the war. And basically what they're saying here is you had a lot of value taken away from you in the form of slaves being set free with the 13th Amendment, and that will not be compensated. There was a big discussion over what they called compensated emancipation. And what that meant was the slave owners would agree to give up their slaves if they were paid a fair sum of money for them. Well, the 14th Amendment says that's not going to happen. You lost your slaves. Get over it. And so when we look at the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment ends slavery in the U.S., and the 14th Amendment grants citizenship rights to African Americans. So naturally, there's going to be a lot of blowback in the American South to this particular amendment. Really what we're seeing is that when you look at the fact that the North is talking about taking voting rights away from white Southern men and giving voting rights and citizenship rights to African Americans, this is freaking the South out. they are losing it, and they're trying to respond to this in any way they can. And the South basically descends into chaos after the passage of the 14th Amendment. And so, in 1867, the Union is going to have to take control of the South more directly, and they pass what are known as the Reconstruction Acts. This is another bolded term here, and I want to be clear. Do not confuse the Reconstruction Amendments with the Reconstruction Acts. They are two totally different things. The Reconstruction Amendments are amendments to our Constitution that are enshrined in our laws to this day, guaranteeing protection to citizens that are of different ethnic, racial descent. Now, the Reconstruction Acts are a little different. They're designed to give Congress control of the American South, and really to give the Union control of the American South. What these acts do, and there's 4 different acts. The first one divides the South into 5 military districts. Those would all be governed by a military commander whose sole purpose was to protect individuals and maintain the peace. Let me translate that into plain English for you. The South is put under military rule. It is a Union Army commander who is in control of all 5 of these military districts. Now, they are there to establish peace. In other words, they're there to protect individual citizens, mostly Northerners who have moved into the post-war South and freed African Americans. Now, once peace was established, Congress would overhaul the process for readmission into the Union, and this would counteract Johnson's former lenient policies for just reform your government willy-nilly and apply again. Once Congress has approved a state's constitution, that state would have to accept the 14th Amendment, and then they could be readmitted. So they'd have to guarantee citizenship rights to the African Americans living in their states. So the next major subject I want to talk about is the formation of a Republican Party in the post-war South. I've been talking rather flippantly about political affiliations throughout this lecture so far. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, the Democrats are the party of the slaveholding South at this point in time. The Democrats are the ones who led the Civil War in the South. And the Republicans are the party that fought to abolish slavery and would be in control of the post-war North. And so you have this political divide. Now, the Republican Party is almost totally absent in the South prior to and during the Civil War. But afterwards, we're going to see the building of a Republican coalition in the American South. They're made up of 3 basic groups. Carpetbaggers, who are northern businessmen and politicians who flooded into the post-war South seeking business opportunities. And they're basically called carpetbaggers because they're all carrying briefcases that look like they're made out of carpet, thus carpetbaggers. So Scalawags are another group. They're kind of few and far between, but these are white Southerners who said, look, we need to get over what happened with the war. We need to get over this reliance on slavery. And they sided with Republicans in passage of the Reconstruction Amendments and Reconstruction Acts. And so they're basically white Southerners who believe in Reconstruction as it's being carried out by the federal government. And then, of course, the last group of Republican voters you would have in the South would be the freedmen. Those are the newly freed and enfranchised African American men. Now, obviously, the Republican Party is the one who set African Americans free from slavery. So in the post-war America, they can count on African Americans. They will always vote for Republicans. They won't vote for Democrats. So the response to some of these sort of changing political landscapes is really the emergence of hate groups. You're going to start to see in this immediate period following the Civil War, you're going to see the emergence of the first Ku Klux Klan, of organizations like the White League. It's important to understand that these groups are all about racial animus. They're all about racial hatred, but they have another aim in mind. When we look at these groups, they also have a political aim. And what the Ku Klux Klan and groups like them are all about in the post-war South is they're trying to suppress African American involvement in politics, and they're trying to suppress anybody who would vote for the Republican Party. So it wouldn't be unlikely for the Ku Klux Klan to attack a white scallywag or a white carpetbagger in the post-war South because they're trying to suppress Republican votes. So ultimately, the 5 military districts that were put under Union Army control in Johnson's presidency, most of them are going to get readmitted to the United States. They're going to meet the demands of Congress. They're going to reapply, and they're going to start getting rolled back into the Union. But it does take a rather long time. And so not all of those districts are going to come back in under Johnson. Some will come back in under the new president, Ulysses S. Grant. And in a lot of ways, Grant is just going to play off of his role in the war. He's the guy, the general who won the Civil War. Now, there is something to be said about the election of 1868. It pits Ulysses S. Grant against a candidate known as Seymour. Seymour is the Democratic candidate, Horatio Seymour, and he is basically running on the platform of white supremacy. And what Seymour does is he goes around in both the North and the South saying that to give African Americans the vote, which is what Republicans are doing, is race treason. It's people turning on their own race. Whereas Grant is just saying, let us have peace. I ended this war. Let the country come together. Grant would win, but it's a very close election. And what this shows us is that Seymour's message of racial animosity and white supremacy played very well in the South, but that's to be expected. But it also played really well in the North. There are still large segments of Northern society at this point that hold very racist viewpoints. And so it shows us that Seymour and his message of racial supremacy still had a foothold and could gain traction in the American North at this point in time. That's the significance of that election. Now, the final Reconstruction Amendment is the 15th Amendment. This is another one of those big key terms. All the Reconstruction Amendments, you need to know what they are and what they establish as part of our laws. They're critically important because they're still on the books to this day. These are still the laws that grant equality and citizenship rights for all Americans, regardless of their race or background. Now, the 15th Amendment would be passed in 1870, and it happened shortly after Grant's election. So really what this is all about is Republicans have to tighten up the language surrounding universal male suffrage in the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is saying African Americans have citizenship and all the rights of citizenship. So that's good, right? That would include, we would think, that includes voting rights. Well, what the South does, as I said, there's this constant sort of ping pong game going on here. The North says African Americans are citizens now. And so they get to vote just like everybody else. Well, the South goes, well, voting, that's not really a citizenship right. That's a privilege. And we're going to deny that privilege to certain citizens within our society. Obviously, they're going to be denying that right to African Americans. In the entire United States at this point, you might think it's kind of odd that I keep talking about African American males, white males. Men are the only ones who can vote at this point in time in American history. In this class, we'll see women's suffrage and when women get the right to vote. But at this point, it's just men. And so, in the 14th Amendment, there's no specific language that says, and we're talking about voting rights as well. And so Congress is going to move and say, look, this amendment is necessary. The 15th Amendment says that a person's race or previous condition of servitude could not bar them from voting or the rights naturally enjoyed by citizens in the U.S. In other words, we've granted African American citizenship. They have all the rights enjoyed by any other citizen. That means men over the age of 21 who are going to be able to vote can vote, and you can't deny them that right. And also, it doesn't matter whether they were a slave or a free person; they still have the right to vote. So that is a critical sort of turn of events. And when we recap all of these Reconstruction amendments, we have the 13th Amendment and slavery. The 14th Amendment grants African American citizenship rights, and the 15th Amendment ensures that African Americans could practice their voting rights. That's what it's really all about. voting rights because the South is denying that to African American citizens at that point in time. So, moving forward, we can look at sort of what's going on with the end of Reconstruction. Really, what starts to happen is Grant is going to win a second term, but he's having a really hard time doing so. Actually he wins in a major landslide over Horace Greeley, his Democratic opponent. But there's really big fractions within his own party. He's being accused of corruption. There's an economic downturn in the United States. And so a lot of what's going on is everybody starts to take their attention off of Reconstruction. They start looking at other issues, the economy, corruption, and politics. And what happens is enough people lose focus on Reconstruction that the South is able to basically sweep the election of 1874. Southern Democrats take control of Congress at this point. And what we're going to see is that the same people who were pushing the Civil War, who were pushing all of this disunity in the post-war era, the ones fighting against Reconstruction and fighting against African American citizenship rights, they are going to be swept into Congress in 1874 because of a lot of internal fractures going on within the Republicans and just general problems happening in the United States. So, by 1876, the Southern Democrats had taken control of Congress, and the old conservative white planter class had largely come back in to dominate the state governments. Furthermore, we see the rise of things like the Mississippi Plan and the Redeemers, and this shows us really clearly the failure of federal Reconstruction plans. The Mississippi Plan is the brutal intimidation of African Americans and white Republican voters in the Reconstruction era South. In other words, the plan is to intimidate people into not exercising their voter rights. Part of the Mississippi Plan is the establishment of voting taxes and literacy tests. These were designed to stop African Americans from voting. In addition to this, you have the emergence of a group known as the Redeemers. This is what the Southern white political class is calling themselves. They're calling themselves the Redeemers or the Saviors of Southern society. What they're really trying to do is this is kind of like a dog whistle saying, we are going to rebuild the South that we know and love, and we're going to reject these federal overtures and policies. And so, the final states of this in the American South, they all have fallen to Southern Democrats. And Reconstruction is generally considered to end in 1877, when the last of the federal troops leave the military districts of the South. And so that's the sort of overall political history of what's going on with Reconstruction. But there's some issues of society and culture that I also want to address. And I'm going to basically move on to those in the second part of our lecture, looking at society, economics, and race relations and what's going on in the post-war South. Right when we start the second part of the lecture, I'm showing a number of graphics there. And it's showing us that, number one, the majority of the American South were non-slave owners. And those who were slave owners, very few had these massive plantations. And so what this is telling us is that with the whole political apparatus of the South trying to reestablish the antebellum period's social and political structure, this is benefiting a very small number of people. Slavery doesn't benefit poor whites. Slavery doesn't necessarily make a slave owner with one or two domestic slaves super wealthy. And so what we're looking at is that a lot of what's going on in the American South happens to go against the best interests of a lot of the Southern class. A lot of the people, white Americans living in the South, are not going to be helped by the reestablishment of the antebellum South. So, what is going to be going on here is that we've had the end of slavery, and there's this economic component to that. Slave labor was the agricultural labor of the Deep South, of the former Confederate States. And so now that slave labor has been ended, that it's no longer legal, you now have a former planter class that has land, equipment, and the initial capital for investment, but they don't have heavy investment in labor. They don't have a whole lot of labor that they can afford to bring onto these farms and work. Whereas you have a former laboring class, namely former African American slaves, they have no access to land, equipment, and they have no capital, but they have labor. And you can see how these two things are going to blend together. So just because slavery's ended doesn't mean that the social and economic dynamics here have changed. You have former slaves are now standing there going, what am I going to do to make money and make a living? Now I have to earn a living. I'm not living on the plantation anymore. I have to have money to pay rent, to buy land. They have nowhere to work. And so what you're going to see happening is that there's two systems that come out to replace the old slave system. And these are known as sharecropping and tenant farming. These are economic aspects of Reconstruction. What's going to happen here is with sharecropping's a lot more sort of pervasive. There's a lot more of an unequal relationship in sharecropping than there is in tenant farming. And we'll look at the differences between the two. But landowners under sharecropping are going to allow laborers to use a plot of land. In other words, I'm going to let you go out and work on my land because I still own a massive plantation. I just don't have anybody to work it. And so instead of paying you, I'm going to say, go ahead and use my land. In return, I am going to get a big proportion of the crop that's produced on this land, and then I'm going to give you a share of it. You get a part of what you work so hard to grow on my land. But unlike a slave, you don't get to live on my land. I'm not putting you up in a shack or any slave quarters. You just are going to have to come to my land, work on it, and then I'm going to basically give you whatever little bit of the profits that I got. And then you get to take it and you go. And that's really, you go back to wherever it is you come from. And this is really important because the property is possessed by the landowner. And the people working it, sharecroppers working on that land, they don't have any say in what's being planted. They don't have any say in what it's being sold for. They're just being handed what they're being told is a share of those profits. And so it's a very, very unequal system. The sharecroppers are in a very bad position economically after the war. It's basically slavery by another name. And then you also have tenant farming. And this is a slightly different system. Here is where the workers will come back to the land and they pay rent to the landowners to live on the land and use it. They get to make their own decisions about what to plant, how much they sell it for, when they sell it. And this is a far more appealing system to poor whites. They tend to take up tenant farming far more often than recently freed African Americans. And there's a few different reasons for this. Number one, they had considerably more resources than freed African Americans. Even though they are poor, they do have a little bit more than African Americans who have just come out of slavery. And so they can afford to pay that rent to live there. And there's another racial caveat to this as well. Former plantation owners are going to say, if I've got to give my labor anything at this point, I'd rather have a white person living on my land, and I'd rather pay them to work the land than an African American. You still have very strong racial attitudes. You still have very strong racial animus towards African Americans amongst the former planter class. And so this is why they extend these opportunities to poor whites to be tenant farmers more often. And so they tended to take this up a lot more. And this would be a position that you're not wealthy or you're not well off in terms of what's happening in your position in American society after the war, but you're better off than a sharecropper is. And so that's the major difference between those two things. But the significance of those is that they are rebuilding the sort of unequal exchange of labor and land ownership that we were seeing in the antebellum South. Again, I like to often describe sharecropping as slavery by another name. You just don't get to live on my land anymore, but I'm still going to tell you what to grow. I'm going to tell you how much it's going to sell for. I'm just going to let you keep a little bit of the money. And oftentimes, sharecroppers were cheated by landowners because they didn't have a very active role in what was going on in the selling of, the marketing of, and the overall price that's fetched for these crops. So that's economically what we see going on in the post-war South. And we'll come back to some other economic issues in a few minutes. But there's also some critical social changes going on here for former slaves during the early phases of Reconstruction. there's new opportunities now, and it's not all doom and gloom for African Americans in the post-war South. They are rushing to legalize informal marriages that had occurred on the slave plantations. And so you see them taking advantage of access to legal structures and systems. We start to see schools being established by the Freedmen's Bureaus and other African American schools. And so African American kids are going to witness a vastly increased amount of access to education. Education starts to become really a prominent part of rebuilding the African American community in the post war South. Most of the Freedmen's Bureau's plans sort of pivot on the idea of educating African Americans so that they can become contributing members of American society. Now, their plans are going to be frustrated, obviously, and we're going to see that throughout the course of our class. But that is a hallmark of the Reconstruction era, is getting education to African American communities. With enfranchisement, African Americans get citizenship and they're guaranteed their right to vote. And let me tell you, they readily exercise them in local, state, and federal elections. African Americans vote in record numbers in the Reconstruction era South, despite being faced with incredible pressure, violence and the threat of violence, threats to their families, their homes, and their businesses being burned down. They still get out and vote and participate in democracy in record numbers during this time. So finally, there are now job opportunities and wages. And so now people aren't working just for free anymore. They actually are going to be able to take some control of their money and be able to try and parlay that into better economic opportunities. So that's the sort of shifts that are occurring socially for African Americans in the post-war South. Now, for poor whites in this economy, things are going to change pretty drastically. Um, During the period of slavery, poor whites weren't readily found in the southern agricultural sector because nobody is going to pay somebody to do a job that they could have a slave do for free. And so they were largely crowded out, and they start to, in the Reconstruction period, poor whites start to enter the agricultural sector. Some of them are so poor off that they enter as sharecroppers, just like newly freed African Americans. A lot of them are going to become tenant farmers. But what starts to happen here is that poor whites are going to find themselves working in the they're doing the same thing newly freed African Americans are doing. All of a sudden, this illusion of racial superiority gets challenged. In the pre-war South, the white underclass was largely kept fighting towards the Confederate goals by saying, look, you might not be wealthy, you might not be a planter or somebody who's super wealthy like me, but hey, at least you're not African American. At least you're one step above in the social structure. Well, guess what? That illusion is gone because now they're working side by side doing the exact same job. This is going to lead to a lot of racial animosity amongst the poor whites in the United States. They're going to start to see themselves being lumped economically in with newly freed African Americans. And they are largely, it's going to be poor whites who start to fill the ranks of these hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan or the White League. So, moving forward, we're going to talk now about black codes. And the black codes, as I mentioned earlier, are really a driving factor and a major mechanism for the New South to try to stop some of these changes that have been made at the federal level as it pertains to African Americans and their citizenship rights in the South. So black codes technically predate the Civil War. They actually emerged back during the colonial period, and they've been in America's history since its very inception. But after the passage of the Reconstruction Acts, they reinvented and reinvigorated these black codes as a way of it's a mechanism to reject any notions or ideas of African American citizenship or voting rights. Now, the black codes would vary by state to state and even by county. These are very localized codes, and they all work a little bit differently. But there's generally just some commonalities that we see amongst them. And if you were to pick up one of these black codes and read it as a primary source, you might be fooled by the language that they use. Most of the black codes are written in such a way so that if you're just reading it on the surface level and you don't understand the context in which it's created, the authors of these codes tended to make them seem as if they were for the benefit of African Americans, when in fact they very much work towards their detriment. So most of the black codes would involve denying access for African Americans to the American court system. So African Americans under most black codes would not be allowed to function as a witness in a court of law. They couldn't give testimony. They couldn't sit on a jury unless it was if there was a jury for a crime that involved a white person. And so what we're seeing is these are all basic rights. We have rights written into our Constitution to have our day in court. And the way that the black codes work is they're saying we don't want to give African Americans access to the courts because they might incriminate themselves. They might end up saying something that gets them into legal trouble. When in all actuality, so again, on the surface, they're trying to make it look like this is for the benefit of black people, but in actuality, they're denying them their rights to actually have their day in court in order to face an accuser, in order to ultimately give their testimony or their version of events. So that's one way that these black codes work. Another way is that they deny African Americans the right to settle where and with whom they want. The vast majority of Southern black codes would carry something called an anti-miscegenation or an anti-code or law. This is a fancy way of saying that this is a moratorium or a ban on interracial marriages and interracial couples. And so this, again, is going to say because, and here you can kind of see the 19th century, the straight white supremacy and the racism coming out, to where they're basically saying, since it's against the natural law and the natural order of things to have interracial marriages, we're denying African Americans the right to marry whites. They're saying we're setting aside a part of the city so that the African Americans can move there and form a community. And all of these parts of the cities that they're giving to African Americans are generally the ones that are the most war-torn, the least developed, the ones that are going to make living very, very difficult. We, of course, have a word for this in the English language. This is called segregation. But this, again, is a way that they're going to try to reject the federal overtures to create some sort of equality amongst the races in the South. They put limitations on African Americans' rights to bear arms. Obviously, every American has a constitutional ability to own a firearm or a weapon. And again, the way these codes are written, they're saying we don't want gun violence becoming a major problem amongst African American communities, so we're denying them their constitutional right to bear arms. And of course, this is also because they're the subjects of a lot of racial violence at this point. Many of these groups don't want them armed because they can functionally defend themselves. Finally, we have black vagrancy laws, sometimes just generally referred to as vagrancy laws. These are major facets of the Black Code, and this ties right in with what I was mentioning about the 13th Amendment. What a vagrancy law says is if you're found unemployed, basically, if you cannot provide evidence or proof that you're an employed individual, you have essentially broken the law. And again, they voice this in the black codes as being like, well, we want to make sure that the African American community is self-sustainable, that they have jobs, that they have employment, they can get on their feet. But what it really amounts to is that they would use these black vagrancy laws to say, do you have a job? And if a person couldn't immediately come up with proof of employment, then they would be arrested and convicted under these vagrancy laws. Now, if you remember me talking about the 13th Amendment, one of the caveats to that amendment was slavery is illegal unless you've been convicted of a crime. And so they would arrest a lot of African Americans under these vagrancy laws in order to falsely imprison them and get them back into the plantation setting as free labor. And so that really kind of sums up the black codes pretty neatly when we see the kind of impact that had on African American communities around the post-war South. And you can see also how this is going to ultimately morph into a lot of the 20th century policies of the Jim Crow South. Now, the reaction to socially to this new empowerment and enfranchisement of African Americans is the formation of paramilitary groups and militias that would ultimately emerge into some of the most notorious terrorist groups in this nation's history. And in this particular period, we see the formation of groups like the White League and the first manifestation of the Ku Klux Klan. So, the White League was formed in 1874 after a major event in Louisiana history known as the Colfax Massacre. You can read all about that in your textbook, and I would strongly promote that because that's a good sort of key term that could come up on an exam. But after this event, this group formed together pretty much with the primary goal of intimidating and deterring African Americans and Republicans from voting in the South. Their secondary goal was to keep order in the society, as they put it. And when we say keep order, what this means to them is to make sure that African Americans behaved socially in a method that was consistent with what was in place in the antebellum period. And so here what we're seeing is that the White League would dress in suits and bowler hats. They'd stand in the streets with canes and guns, and they would intimidate African Americans, certainly. But what you're tending to see of the White League is they're really concerned with, like I said, social interaction. They want to make sure that African Americans know their place in this new society. And so it's about ensuring that African Americans continue to tip their hat and bid a good day to a white person that they passed. And if they didn't, it might, ultimately lead to violence right there in the streets. And this group is really critical. The significance of the White League is that their presence in the American South, particularly in Louisiana, is that they're helping to usher a lot of the Southern Democrats back into power through voter intimidation and violence. They are one sort of arm of this Mississippi Plan or the Redeemers. They're all part of that, helping to intimidate Republican voters and get Southern Democrats back into power. Ultimately, a lot of the people who are part of this organization they were given positions in the state militias and the National Guard. So that the people who are responsible for racial violence are also the people who are responsible for keeping peace and order and structure in the American South. So, ultimately, the White League kind of pales in comparison to the notoriety of the other group we're going to be talking about, and that is the first manifestation of the Ku Klux Klan. This group formed in Pulaski, Tennessee in the winter of 1865 and 1866, and it was formed by 6 former Southern Confederates. They're pretty much just like the White League. Their number one goal is to stop Republicans from voting in the South. The Klan and the White League are not above attacking white people who are voting for Republicans in the South. But there is also that other component of they are really, really dedicated to intimidating African Americans and ultimately harassing them in their homes, in their communities, in the streets. And there is definitely a racial component, obviously, to the Ku Klux Klan, as we all know. Unlike their White League counterparts, the Ku Klux Klan had to hide their faces. They had to keep the idea of it. They didn't have the uniform white hoods and robes that we're familiar with today, but they did wear face coverings, and that's because this group was actively and openly hunted by the federal government. The types of crimes, the depravity of the acts of the Ku Klux Klan, this early manifestation of it, ultimately led to them being really heavily targeted by the federal government underneath Ulysses S. Grant. And they were ultimately going to be wiped out and forced to go underground. This group goes further than the White League. It's not about somebody tipping their hat in the street. It's about following somebody back to their home and burning their home to the ground. It's about not just beating somebody, but dragging them out of their home and killing them, mutilating their corpse, hanging them up as an intimidation tactic. The things that the Ku Klux Klan were up to were so heinous that the members could not afford to be identified in public because they would ultimately be summarily found as terrorists if they were caught and then executed. So a number of factors are going to contribute to the sort of rapid fall of the first Ku Klux Klan. First, there is no central organization here. There is no grand wizard, nobody who pulls the strings for the entire Ku Klux Klan. They're just sort of diffuse small units that work on a local level. In addition to that, many of the Klan members' actions were innately and fully despised and hated, even by other Southern Democrats who are trying to reinstitute the slaveocracy of the Old South. They think that the Klan goes too far. And then, of course, their notoriety is drawing way too much attention at the federal level. Ulysses S. Grant is going to use the federal army to root out the Ku Klux Klan and bring them down. So, the last topic I wanted to talk about was economic, and to a certain degree, economics and social things kind of go hand in hand. But there is going to be an increasing push towards industrialism. This is something that didn't really exist in the pre-war South. It's a society that's largely agricultural. But with the emergence of carpetbaggers, with northerners coming down into these southern cities, they're bringing their economic mode of production with them when the South is being rebuilt. And so they start building up large industrial centers. As a result, there's more job opportunities and more people flood into urban centers right around these industrial centers. This leads to increased urbanization. And so it's really during this Reconstruction period that we see the large urban centers of the South starting to take shape. And this has a sort of twofold impact. You have some positives coming out of this. In a lot of ways, the old social customs have to get thrown in the trash because the people who are coming down and setting up this new industrial economic scheme, they don't tolerate some of the most open forms and overt expressions of racism that were used to be acceptable in Southern society. So to work within the New South, you had to kind of abandon some of those ideas, or at least those habits. The ideas might still very much be there, but the habits in public need to go away because it's not conducive with a self-sufficient industrial society. You're also going to see the growth of a burgeoning middle class in the South. And then we also start to see the urban centers like New Orleans, Nashville, Raleigh, Charlotte. They all start to build up more vertically. But not everything is good. This is bringing money into the South. It's diversifying their economy. But a growing middle class meant fewer economic opportunities for low-class whites and African Americans who had just been recently released from slavery. With the increased mechanization in the workforce, fewer laborers are really needed in the new industrial South. This leads to horrific living conditions in the new cities, and it promotes a lot of poverty around the American South as well. As a result, you're going to tend to see a mass exodus of lower class laborers out of the South, both black and white. African Americans tend to go north and then also to a lesser degree west, whereas poor whites are going to flee the South moving west. In terms of infrastructure, mobility in the South gets much greater. That now all of a sudden, because you see these cities popping up all over, they now need to connect them, and railroads start to increase hand in hand with the growth of these new American cities. And so when all this starts to happen, people are going to be able to move more easily around the South, but it also makes it easier to get up and leave. So in the end, at the end of all of this, what we're looking at here is that in the South, things are changing very, very rapidly, but in a lot of ways, the old racial politics of the antebellum South have come right back in. The conservative Southern Democrats have come back in and taken over the governments. And what we see is the extrajudicial killings of African Americans around the South, the loss of job opportunities. This all leads to the beginnings of what we will ultimately encounter as the Jim Crow South. And this will spark something known as the Great Migration, where millions of African Americans decide life in the South is not worth it anymore, and they're going to leave for the industrial centers of the North. These are topics that we're going to address a little bit later in the class. But to sum all of this up, throughout the Reconstruction period, what we see is the federal government trying to enact change in the South, and the South finding loopholes and fighting back against it. And by the time the federal government calls Reconstruction officially closed in 1877, we see that very little has changed on the ground to improve the condition of African Americans living in the post-war South. And this is going to leave us with a legacy that we'll be dealing with throughout the rest of the class. So that wraps up my lecture for this week. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, anything like that, feel free to shoot me an email or set up an appointment for office hours. Take care.